Now I could see right down to the bottom of the whirlpool where the horrible monster lay. Her vast tentacles swirled the water around, and her bulbous octopus eyes stared greedily up, waiting for me to fall. But I held on and waited for 1 hour and then another, and still she sucked the whirlpool in. Finally, Charybdis could hold it in no longer, and with a great gush, the undigested contents of her belly flew into the air around me. As soon as the water had settled, I dived and swam furiously away from the cliff. The mass was floating in the middle of the straits, and I managed to grab a hold of it once more. Now I was within reach of the cruel Scylla, but Zeus must have been watching over me. A powerful current carried me out of the straits before she sensed that I was there. For 9 days and nights I drifted with the currents. They took me around the southeast headland of Thrinacia, but although I was parched and hungry, I dared not set foot on those fateful shores again. Then the currents carried me slowly west, farther and farther away from my long lost home. On the 10th morning, I was finally washed up on an unknown shore. I was too weak to move and my throat was too dry to utter a sound. I lay on the burning sand beneath the cruel sun, waiting to die. Then I must have passed out because Calypso told me later that she'd found me laying on the beach, unconscious and half dead. She dragged me back to her cavern of marble and gold and nursed me back to life. I opened my eyes to see the lovely nymph staring down at me, her braided hair falling toward my face. She had laid me on a bed of the softest down, covered my burned, cracked skin with cold, wet cloths, and poured cool spring water between my parched lips. I tried to speak, but no words came out. She placed a finger over my mouth and smiled her lovely smile. I gazed at her in the wonder until I fell into a deep sleep. I slept long and often over the following weeks as I gradually regained my strength. When I was awake, Calypso would sit by my bed while I recounted the story of Troy and told her of my ill-fated journey home. I learned in turn that she was an immortal nymph who lived alone on her island, Ogygia. Her father was Atlas, the titan who holds up the sky. She had been warned of my arrival, for my fame went before me, even among the gods. She said that I should stay with her until I fully recovered. Soon it was clear that she wanted me to stay much longer. Calypso had fallen in love with me and offered me the gift of eternal life if I would live with her forever. It was hard to refuse a goddess, but I longed for Ithaca and Penelope, my wife. I pleaded with her to let me go, but she would not give me up. And so my life with Calypso began. 1 year passed, and then another. Every morning I went down to the beach on the eastern shore of Ogygia and looked out across the sea, pining for my home. Meanwhile, Calypso sat at her loom in her sumptuous cavern in the woods and sang in a voice like Circe's as she wove her beautiful cloths. Every evening, while the sun set behind me on the far side of the island, I made my way wearily back through the cypress woods to the enchanted grove in front of Calypso's cavern. Here, vines and wild roses grew in abundance, and hidden among them, nightingales sang. Small grassy meadows, thick with wildflowers, sloped down to clear streams, fed by the crystal waters of the 4 springs that bubbled up in the grove. It was a heavenly place, fit for a god, and Calypso was more beautiful than any mortal woman. But it was not my home, and deep in my heart I was sad. 7 years passed, and I still yearned for Ithaca. Then, one evening, I returned from the beach to find Calypso sobbing on her bed, her face buried in the pillows. I put out a hand to comfort her, but she flinched away from my touch. I sat beside the bed and waited. At last, she turned her face toward me, pale and red eyed. Dear, brave Odysseus, she said in a trembling voice, rejoice. You have your wish at last. Great Zeus has ordered me to let you go, and though it breaks my heart, I must obey him. She took me in her arms and held me close as though she would never let me go. At dawn, Calypso brought me a bronze axe, an adze, and a box of finely balanced tools. Then she took me to a place where a forest of silver firs rose tall and straight into the sky. I began working immediately. During the days that followed, I'd felled 20 of the finest trees. cleaned them, and cut the timber down to size. I shaped the wood and pegged and jointed the pieces together. When I had finished, I had a small boat to use for my journey home. Calypso brought me cloth for the sail and rope for the braces and halyards, and I was ready to set out to sea. It was early dawn when Calypso led me down to the beach and helped me load my boat with water, food, and wine. Then I took her hand and asked her to understand my desire to grow old and die with my wife and family around me. Neither the beauty of a goddess nor the promise of immortality could ever mean as much to me. She smiled sadly and shook her head. I will never understand the ways of men. Go now, may Zeus watch over you, for I wish you well. If you keep the great bear to your left, you will steer a true course for home. With these words, she turned away from me and disappeared forever through the trees.